Welcome to the GSMC Pets Podcast, the show that caters to pet lovers of all kinds. We'll talk about pets on social media, pets doing amazing things, and how to take care of the pets in your life. Whether your pet is a dog, a cat, a llama, hamster, reptile, or something more exotic, you'll find educational and entertaining information on the GSMC Pets Podcast.
Thanks once again for tuning in to the GSMC Pets Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex Fletes. Now, this is honestly an episode that I've been ready to do for a long time. I'm super excited for it. It's honestly a really fun topic. So if you know me, there are two things you should know about me. One, it's that I'm a huge nerd, very huge nerd. And two is that I love birds. So I'm a pretty big bird nerd. So when it comes down to it, I love getting to talk about any topics of these two, how fascinating those creatures are and how fun the animal kingdom can be. And I love getting to talk about nerdy things. So I'm kind of going to be combining the two today. So a topic that I really haven't gotten to touch on too much, but I'm finally going to take some time to talk about it right now, is the illustrious, the fascinating, the exclusive group of avians that have earned a name for themselves across media and honestly are some of the coolest avians around. Today we're going to be discussing birds of prey. And besides being a DC, comic series and movie, they are initially birds that are, large hunters. They are hunters. They are, avians that actually, feed and hunt on other vertebrae, usually having some pretty common features amongst each other, but also having a lot of very interesting and distinctive features that make each one of them unique as well. And on top of that, I also really wanted to take some time to talk about some of the fun real-world inspirations for the, fictional characters or fictional animals inside of the fantastic, world-renowned video game series Pokemon. Not because it's just an excuse to talk more about Pokemon, but rather because I do really notice a lot of real-world inspirations behind some of these fantastical creatures, and I wanted to share just how big it can be to have creatures that are real transition over into a fictional setting and see how real the inspirations can be and how fascinating it honestly can be if you take the time to look and learn. And that's ultimately my goal. So I'm going to start off pretty simple today, and let's start us off with one of the smaller of the groups, but one of the more fascinating ones myself. So of the birds of prey variety, one of the, I guess, more common but still fairly powerful for its size bird would be a falcon. And I myself actually have a little bit of history with falcons. Where I live right now, there are falcons, flying around my house constantly. And keep in mind, because they are birds of prey, they do feed on smaller animals, mice, and sometimes some small animals, maybe squirrels, but also they do fight off and sometimes eat smaller birds as well. But because they are actually smaller in size than other birds of prey, they don't actually do that as often. Now, what's fascinating about falcons is that they have some pretty interesting structures about their wing size and shape. So what's interesting is that they are incredibly agile, able to fly at high speeds, very useful for a bird of prey. But what is interesting is that certain falcons actually have longer flight feathers, which actually make it more for general purpose flight. So there are sort of more broad-winged and there are longer feathered falcons. So what's interesting about this is that some falcons have more broad wings, are actually able to fly in place as opposed to just have to continuously moving and perching. That's very fascinating for a bird, since not many of them actually have that ability to. It's mainly because of the way that their wings are structured. Very, very useful ability too. Now, what is also useful to note is that falcons, along with most birds of prey and most animals, have sexual dimorphism, which means that between the two genders of birds, the female typically is the bigger of the two. So if you ever take a look and see two falcons perched next to each other, the bigger one will usually be the female. Very useful to know. Very, very useful information. On top of that, a certain breed of falcon, the peregrine falcons, have actually been recorded as one of the fastest moving creatures on Earth at nearly 200 miles an hour. And that's actually very important to what I'm going to talk about relating to a fictional creature in just a little bit. Now, on top of that, there are some other interesting facts about falcons as well. But what is important to note about falcons, and specifically birds of prey, is some of the physical characteristics about them. Now, birds of prey will typically have at least these few characteristics. Usually they're going to have a sharp beak because they have to be able to rip into their prey. Now, their beaks are sharp but usually curved and pretty short. They don't usually have a need for a long or really anything else for their beak. They just need to be able to rip. Falcons, though, have a small sort of curvature near the tip of the beak that works sort of like a second tooth because they have to be able to grip tightly and get to their prey faster. This is actually pretty exclusive mainly to falcons. Now, on top of that, what also is interesting about falcons is that, of course, most birds of prey will have powerful talons, usually sharp and powerful to be able to grip prey. Definitely useful. And then on top of that, they usually will have some type of specific vision. Vision is very important for birds of prey to be able to spot prey, obviously. Because without powerful enough vision, how are they ever going to be able to capture any useful type of prey? But falcons actually are very special, having that special brand of flying, their sort of differences in wings, which also does seem to be very symbolic of the Marvel character Falcon. If you've ever seen how they fly, how the character flies, he's able to sort of turn and maneuver very quickly in the sky. While he is quick, he's also very agile in the air, which is definitely useful for the character and actually does make sense to why he would be called Falcon. Now, let's go ahead and flip over on the nerdy end of things and talk about the fictional inspiration of a character known as the Pokemon Talonflame. Now, this one is actually very fascinating. This Pokemon is a fire bird. Usually the bird-type Pokemon in, Pokemon are usually normal flying type. This one's a fire flying type, and it makes a lot of sense as to why. Talonflame is one of the faster of the, flying type bird Pokemon, with really powerful abilities as well that boost its flying typing. Keep in mind how much of an emphasis it gets on flying typing because, along with real-world falcons, Talonflame has really powerful abilities about its agile and sort of speedy nature. In fact, this Pokemon was so powerful, it actually broke the meta of the game for a while because it was so overpowered. Eventually, they managed to sort of rectify this, but it still didn't change the fact that this Pokemon was and still pretty much is a threat. Looking at this Pokemon too, its design is almost a shot-for-shot recreation of a falcon, having a very curved, small beak, but it's still very sharp, large talons, hence the name Talonflame, and its wings are actually more of a small, skinnier shape, but still in a long shape as well. And it's a pretty big bird as well. Its pre-evolved forms, such as Fletchling and Fletchinder, are actually derived of Fletchling small birds, and actually do have a design similar to more grounded prey birds. So it's actually interesting how it eventually becomes a bird of prey with its beak becoming sharper. On top of that, this is a very, very powerful Pokemon. It has a lot of It has a lot of references to the peregrine falcon. As I said already, one of the fastest falcons out there. So this is actually really, really good inspiration for a Pokemon, seeing as looking at its design, its body shape, its wingspan. This is absolutely a dead ringer for a real world falcon. except that it has fire powers. But other than that, I mean, its speed, its power, it definitely is a really good recreation, and really fascinates me how developers can create such a amazing and creative interpretation of a real world creature into a fantasy world, and both be faithful but also be incredibly creative with its design as well, taking inspiration from the real world. But with that being said, I'm going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about more amazing birds of prey and their really amazing abilities, the real-world relations they have, and how cool these creatures really are. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Thanks for sticking around. We are back here on the Pet Podcast. We're talking today about the birds of prey and the fantastical, powerful, winged beasts that control the skies. Now, we just spent a little while talking about falcons and how amazing and surprisingly powerful they are for such little creatures. But now we're going to talk about another well-known avian, another bird of prey that some people tend to forget is a bird of prey because it doesn't want anyone to know it's even there. So this is the bird of rotating head, the barnyard avian, the know-it-all bird itself, the owl. The owl is an interesting case because even myself, I forgot it was a bird of prey until I did some more research on it. And what's fascinating is that it has all of the aspects of a bird of prey that I already mentioned previously, the talons, the beak, etc. But what's fascinating about it is that it has so many things that most birds of prey won't have that make it stand out that much more and also make it that much more of a threat. So let me go over some of that with you. So, an owl, which is very fascinating in itself, is different because of its first off, different places that you may find it. You may find a regular barnyard owl in places like, say, a barn, or maybe in a, small rural area. But then you might also have other owls, like a horned owl, that you might find in more places like, out in the great outdoors, or you might find it in more, actual, forested areas rather than just simple near people, which is already fascinating in itself. Now, what's fascinating about owls is that they have a few other, shall we say, abilities and skills that other creatures don't have. First off is one of the obvious things about an owl is that they have a very, very strange ability to move their head. Their head moves in nearly a 360-degree manner. Now, I'll explain as to why in just a minute. But what is also interesting is all of the other things they do have that make them birds of prey. So the first major thing that makes them a bird of prey is, of course, the beak. The beak is sharp and it's curved. It's not a large beak, unlike other birds. So with large beaks, typically usually means they're more of a scavenger, or that they may scoop up bigger prey, but they might scoop them up in a one motion like a pelican. Now, for a small beak like a owl, it's short, curved, and facing down. It's got a nice hook at the edge for tearing into prey, of course. So it's really good for taking out a prey. On top of that, it also has, of course, powerful talons for grabbing onto and latching onto prey and scooping them up whenever it needs to be. Now, an owl isn't notoriously huge. It's still a smaller bird of prey, but it's still a pretty big bird. But what is good about the owl is a lot of the extra skills that it makes up for without being a powerful bird of prey. Now, owls are indeed powerful, but it's because of their unique skill set that makes them so powerful. First off, let's talk more about their incredible eyesight. Their eyesight is incredibly powerful, seeing more than double the amount of a human can see. And it has one of my favorite abilities, night vision. So that automatically secludes itself from being a really amazing bird. But let's also talk about that rotating head. If it can see at nearly 360 degrees, which means completely around in a whole circle, front to back, side to side, then it would be able to see in all directions without having to move its body. But having nearly that much, it's able to see most of its area, scan its area with little movement. So because of that, it's able to look around, survey a whole area, and see everything in its area with quick precision and little sound. On top of that, owls are also binocular vision. Most birds have vision on the side or more skewed to the left and right so they can see what's coming and going. Owls see what's in front of them like people do. So they're able to scan around like a watchtower or like a searchlight, able to search everything it needs to see, and then when it has a target, it's able to launch. And that brings me to the final most important thing owls are able to do, and that's fly with next to no sound. You can actually see videos of this, and it's really fascinating. But the way owls' wings are curved, they sort of have more of a curve inward, so when they flap their wings, you hear next to nothing until it's too late. Whereas most birds, when they fly, they'll have more of a sort of sound going with them. So you'll be able to hear them coming, and most enemies can prepare or run away in time. That's what makes an owl so formidable as a foe. Whereas, as humans, if we had the ability to see at night, if we had the ability to move through the air or move on ground without a sound, and then we had the ability to see twice our vision, we could do all of that. We would be formidable foes. So that's why owls are incredibly, incredibly amazing birds of prey. Now, they're never going to get large as large as some of the other birds of prey, but they are still incredibly powerful birds of prey nonetheless. But with that being said, I want to sort of pivot over to another nerdy fictional creature as well. Now, I didn't mention things such as owls' physiology, dimorphism, and also they have the ability of camouflage, or rather rough camouflage. But that goes without saying because most animals will have some form of camouflage. And of course, the larger of the species are usually going to be the females. But what I do want to talk about is the amazing inspiration for one of the most infamous / famous Pokemon out there. So right now, when it comes to Pokemon, the owl is a very underrepresented Pokemon, but it does have a couple sort of figures in that line. But the Pokemon that has the honor of being the first owl-like Pokemon, or fully formed Pokemon, is Noctowl, which automatically in its name already has a lot of inspiration with owls and of course their ability of nocturnal activity. On top of that, Noctowl is based off of a horned owl, so it is definitely more of a wild owl as opposed to a slightly more refined barnyard owl. Now, what's interesting about this one having a dark brown color is that it blends in with trees very easily, just like a real owl would. But what I do find most interesting is that although this is built roughly like most other flying type Pokemon with the same typings and such, it has abilities such as Keen Eye and Insomnia, and it also has moves like Foresight and abilities to detect Pokemon that usually can't be detected, such as Ghost-type Pokemon that usually can't be afflicted by normal or physical-type moves. It has the ability to detect with its amazing eyesight, which makes it so powerful, and actually makes sense because flying types, an owl's vision is incredibly powerful to be able to detect things that usually can't be seen, which makes a ton, and I mean a ton, of sense. Now, what makes this Pokemon exceptionally special? In the series, they have this thing called shiny Pokemon, which are Pokemon that have sort of different colorations from their normal color. So in this case, Noctowl is usually a dark brown color, but its shiny form is a lot more sort of goldish green. Now, here's the problem. If a creature has a brighter color, usually a prey has a brighter color, it becomes an easy target for any predators. So, with a creature like this, Noctowl being the first one in the anime to actually get its shiny coloring means it's actually difficult to survive in the wild simply because it loses its camouflage. This actually does happen in the real world with albinism and other things like that as well. So it's actually interesting that we get to see a creature like that has to adapt to its surroundings and has to change the way it hunts based off of a coloration that it has no control over. It's very, very fascinating that something like shiny Pokemon would make its way into the series, showing that its actual physical discoloration that can actually affect a species or an individual creature because it's not able to adapt to its surroundings. Something really amazing that I find that occurs in this game. Sure, most people see it as a novelty or as a special gift, but it's also a bit of a hindrance for wild creatures trying to live a natural life. But with that being said, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about more interesting Pokemon, more powerful birds of prey, and some interesting facts behind them you probably didn't know. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
I want to talk to you guys about this amazing product I've been using lately called Hydrant. If you're like me and you want to kick the coffee habit, but you're worried about your energy levels depleting, to avoid the morning sluggishness and that midday slump, you need to make sure you're hydrated. It's super important. And that's where I've been using Hydrant. And for 25% off your first order, you can go to drinkhydrant.com and enter promo code GSMC at checkout. Hydrant is basically flavored electrolyte packets you mix directly into your water to make hydrating your body easy and delicious. And what I love about Hydrant, it's backed by research. The formula was developed by Oxford scientists to provide perfectly balanced, efficient hydration. Again, that's drinkhydrant.com and enter promo code GSMC for 25% off your first order. Another really cool thing about Hydrant, there's no synthetic colors or artificial sweeteners. The formula is vegan and you can choose between 3 different flavors or a variety pack. So for all my vegan friendly fellows out there, this one's for you. Again, this is drinkhydrant.com and enter promo code GSMC.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And thanks for sticking around today, guys. We're talking about birds of prey and the fantastical, powerful creatures they are and the amazing real-world inspirations they have. So we've talked a good bit about some other birds of prey, the falcon and the owl. But how about we talk about the big one, the one everyone knows, the one that pretty much is the poster boy for the entire, classification of birds. We're talking about the eagle. Now, obviously, when you think about eagle, you probably think about the bald eagle, which is indeed a bird of prey, but it's not the bird of prey, and for good reason. While it is one of the most powerful birds of prey, it's not exclusively the strongest bird of prey. There is actually a few other ones above it, but it is one of the most powerful creatures in that ranking. So, obviously, let's go over the quick basics of the bird of prey, the eagle, and why it's so strong. First things first is obviously with any type of birds of prey, you have the obvious factors. It has a very sharp razor beak, very important. Now, this is actually really important to notice, is that while most birds of prey have more of a rounded, super curved beak that sort of has more of a scissoring motion, the eagle's, while still having that, is a lot longer, more razor, and bigger. This is because the eagle can take down bigger prey. So, because it takes down bigger prey, it's able to actually sort of hunt down and it's able to sort of take on things that might be bigger than its size, and it needs to be able to sort of rip and tear into bigger objects. Usually having a bigger beak is a bit of a faux pas for a bird of prey, but the eagle is, of course, an exception. Now, the bald eagle is, again, very powerful. In fact, it's so impressive that it's actually been known to carry some of the heaviest loads of any flying bird, being about 15 pounds of a mule deer. So, a young mule deer at about 15 pounds is very impressive for any bird, seeing as birds have a lighter bone structure and a much lighter body mass. So it's actually really impressive that an eagle, a bald eagle, is able to take care of that. Now, on top of that, one thing that the bald eagle and the eagles in general have is also a very impressive talon strength. So, like I said, they're able to lift up to 15 pounds, possibly even more, but their talons are usually where a lot of that goes. On top of that, though, there are a couple other that are listed as potentially stronger, with a lot of them being such as the Stellar Sea Eagle, the Philippine Eagle, the Harpy Eagle, the White-tailed Eagle, and the Martial Eagle. But the Bald Eagle is still, again, one of the most powerful and definitely most well known. Now, on top of that, they also have incredible sights, as most birds of prey will have. But what's interesting about the eagle is their variety and able to sort of hunt in multiple areas, and the sort of airtime they get in their flight. Now, bald eagles typically like to sort of perch themselves onto like cliff sides, and they usually just let momentum sort of take care of them rather than sort of working for it. So usually it might be, a bald eagle builds a nest right on the edge of a cliff, or on a cliff side, and then if they're lucky and they pick a nest right on the cliff side by the water, then they are pretty much set for life. One of the best things you could actually go see, and I highly recommend, is going to take a look at is going to go and take a look at a video of a bald eagle scooping a fish off the water. This is one of the coolest things. What they'll do is they'll just kind of sit and wait, and the second they see a fish close enough to the top of the water, they'll just sort of just fall off of the cliffside and just glide down towards the fish they see that they want, and then with talons out and extended, they just scoop it right out of the water and just go. It's really amazing. And believe it or not, bald eagles and eagles can actually fly. They're not, can swim. Of course they can fly. They're not really made for swimming, but it is possible. What they'll actually do is if they get pulled into the water and they can make it back to the surface, they'll sort of like fly in a flapping motion, and they'll sort of like very slowly fly on the water, I think it's like a breaststroke, where it's just like kind of flap until they get to dry land. It can dry off. It's interesting. I've never seen that sort of thing actually happen until recently. There's a lot of really fascinating videos out there that I highly recommend going to check out. Now, of course, there are also multiple varieties of eagles. They're definitely some of the most powerful, and the bald eagle definitely does earn its place as one of the most well-known eagles. And eagles are also fascinating too. Things like their name and descriptions, that the name Aquila, which is actually sort of their modern root name, Aquila, which kind of comes from I believe it means let me see here, because that's actually an interesting fact. Aquila is actually really important too for the eagle, because it's actually one of the few animals that actually has a star constellation and named after itself. What is fascinating as well is that eagles also do have really important placement in a lot of culture. They usually use as coat of arms as well. So people really do see eagles as power. They see them as creatures that are able to sort of take to the sky and take charge. Some people even call them the lion of the sky, which does make some sense. And creatures like a griffin actually do sort of take that as well. So it's definitely very interesting as well. But since we're talking about it, let's go ahead and kind of shift over to the nerdy half of the things and talk about real-world inspirations. So when it comes to real-world inspirations, specifically of creatures to fiction, Pokemon is always the way I like to go. And with Pokemon, I love to talk about how real-world animals have inspired these very well-known very well-known creatures. So the Pokemon known as Pidgeot is very fascinating because while there's another eagle Pokemon, but it's straight up based off of a bald eagle, and it's nothing too special to really talk about. Pidgeot actually does have a lot of eagle inspiration as well, evolving from the Pokemon Pidgey and Pidgeotto. But you'd think that a Pokemon that has Pidgey in its name would be more pigeon design, when in reality, Pidgeot has a lot of eagle built into it. Its body, its broad wings, sharp beak, which is almost parallel to an eagle's beak, I might add. Big talons. A lot of it is actually very reminiscent of an eagle's design, despite being named Pidgeot, or from the Pidgey line. Now, what is also fascinating is that rather than being, sort of designed off of a bald eagle, it seems to have some inspirations from a few other of them, and when it does have a shiny form, it actually does resemble more or less of a golden eagle. Now, having a lot of these features, also having high speed stats, a lot of sort of predatory and physical moves, makes this very, very, very similar in design to an eagle in real life. And one of the most important things is also how it also does derive from some Egyptian mythology as well, under its eyes and shape, sort of deriving from inspirations of creatures like Ra and Horus. So it's actually pulling from multiple places, because actually birds do have a lot of prominence in Egyptian mythology as well. On top of that, having really powerful, sort of big talons and design, it's a really interesting way that they designed this creature with eagles and hawks and birds of prey in mind, but also leaving room for there to be more design later on. So it's really fascinating what they decided to do with this creature, and why it's one of my favorites. But with that being said, we're going to go on another quick break. But when we come back, we're going to talk about a few more birds of prey and some interesting real-world parallels as well, and just sharing some really fun facts with you. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea? Then the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
And thanks for sticking around today. Today we are talking about the birds of prey and the incredible, powerful birds that they are and the amazing facts you may not have known. So we've taken a lot of time to talk about a few birds of prey, owls, eagles, falcons, very, very amazing birds. But now I want to talk about one that is definitely very fascinating to me, very interesting, very unexpected of a powerful bird, and one that kind of really takes the best traits out of all of the birds of prey and actually gets misunderstood very frequently for what it is capable of. And we're talking about the hawk. So interesting thing about the hawk is that it kind of classifies into a lot of other species of birds of prey, and some birds of prey are actually somewhat considered hawks as well. They're definitely in a way, sort of like the jack of all trades when it comes to them, most birds of prey. For obvious examples, you have things such as, for example, having powerful talons, powerful wings, such as like that. They'll all definitely classify into a lot of those sort of things. Having a very powerful curved beak, it's definitely larger than most birds of prey, but it's not as large as, say, an eagle or the bigger birds of prey. It definitely has razor-sharp beak that can just kind of rip to shreds its prey, but at the same time it still has powerful talons to grab prey as well. And its size is actually larger than most, larger than the falcon at least. So anything below the size of a falcon, a hawk's automatically going to have some priority over that. But on top of that, there are a lot of other sort of groups of hawks as well. There's two of them. There's hen hawks and wood hawks. But there's also a lot of subclasses, a lot of other things, because hawks have such a wide range of classes that makes them very fascinating. So one thing that a lot of birds of prey seem to have in common is incredible eyesight, and the hawks definitely have some of the most impressive eyesight. They're definitely able to see, well, twice the length of human vision, but they also are very fascinating because unlike owls, which are able to see in the dark, and some other birds of prey that are able to see incredibly far distances, hawks are actually able to see some color receptors that are usually invisible to the normal eye. So it's actually capable of perceiving not only the visible light range, but also ultraviolet lights, which can actually help for hunting, along with being able to sort of allow the vision of magnetic fields as well. It's really impressive, actually, having that ability. On top of that, which is really cool about them, is that they actually are very smart. They are probably one of the highest avian IQs out there, and for good reason, I might add, because they are not only adaptive to their environments, but they also have a few really impressive abilities as well. For example, usually whenever a hawk flies, it's going to flap its wings rapidly and then use the momentum to glide through the air, so it actually sort of coasts for a while rather than simply perpetually flapping. On top of that, something that's pretty interesting too is that the hawk will usually kill its prey with talons, but there are actually times when it'll actually sort of find very specific times to hunt. The times whenever animals are at their weakest or animals are going to be at their slowest. On top of that as well, they're also very adaptive and very resourceful. So what they'll typically do is when they're going to go for a prey, rather than sort of cycling, what they'll do is they'll actually soar very high and they'll use the momentum and dive bomb prey. So rather than simply, going at it and trying to hunt down its prey, it'll actually dive bomb its prey very quickly, using that momentum rather than simply trying to stalk its prey and fight it down, which is very impressive for any type of animal or avian especially. It'll actually use resourceful abilities to find what it's looking for. It's really amazing. Also, really fun fact, if you've ever actually seen any type of movie or TV show that has a bird on screen and it gives a very large screech, more than likely that is a hawk's screech. So if you see an eagle or maybe a big bird kind of give a large, screech, that's probably a hawk screech, which I actually have here if you can hear this at all. So hopefully you were able to hear that, but if not, just look up a hawk screech and you'll actually see this, you'll actually see, oh yeah, I've heard that before. Yeah, that's a hawk. Huh, good to know. And their screech is very powerful, very intimidating as well. I myself have gotten to see this up in person, but if you haven't, there's this really great video of a hawk that got, trapped in a soccer net, and, some guys came to cut it out, but it was so intimidated, it was trying to still keep a facade that it was in control, that it kept giving this really piercing screech from a close distance, and even listening through my device, I still felt the power behind that screech. So it really is amazing. That's a good way to intimidate foes, which is really, really useful, especially for such a prime predator like this. But because of that, I also want to take some time to flip over into the more nerdy side of things. So this one I'm actually really excited for because this is one of my favorite flying type Pokemon, and it's definitely got one of my favorite designs, but it's got also a lot of my favorite movesets from it. So this is the flying type Pokemon known as Staraptor. So immediately the name Staraptor automatically indicates that it's a bird of prey because most birds of prey are raptors. Star coming from starling, which is the Pokemon it's technically based off of. What's interesting about it is that its starting ability is Intimidate. So if you've ever played the game, a Staraptor has a screech cry that sounds very similar to a hawk's cry. So the Intimidate ability actually makes a lot of sense if you've ever seen a hawk screech in person. So that actually makes a lot, and I mean a lot of sense. Also, its hidden ability is called Reckless, which makes its physical moves a lot stronger. This actually makes a lot more sense too when I've already told you hawks like to dive bomb opponents. So prey likes to dive bomb. Reckless makes a lot of sense in the fact that it could also be very dangerous if an opponent is prepared. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? So, on top of that, if you ever see a Staraptor, it's got sort of a gray appearance, a very faint gray appearance, and it's actually one of the larger flying type bird Pokemon out there, which again, raptors are usually the bigger of the birds of prey. So birds of prey technically have size over most birds. Makes a lot of sense. Now, remember how I told you that raptors are also specifically hawks, they have a lot of physical prowess, very strong talons. Well, Staraptor is also a very, very physical bird. One of the few flying types that'll learn a lot of fighting type moves. So because a hawk will dive bomb its opponents, because it will be very quick, very agile, a lot of its moves make sense, like Final Gambit and Close Combat being ways for it to physically attack its prey. On top of that, having a lot of very quick moves to move around faster makes it all the more powerful. Now, looking at this design, you may say, how is this a hawk? First off, its shiny form actually gives it a brown coloring, which makes it much more, reminiscent of that. But its design, its sort of cut actually resembles not only a hawk, but also a harpy eagle. So it actually does pull in inspiration from other places. And looking at the harpy eagle right now, it does look a lot like this. It's black and white coloring. It's sort of intimidating long beak, and especially around the talons, it's definitely a clear-cut inspiration, which blows my mind seeing how close these kind of things actually work. And again, listen for a Staraptor's call. It's very similar to a hawk's call, which you should definitely go take a look at during this break. Because while we go away on a quick break, I'm going to prepare for one more really awesome bird of prey and some more interesting facts you probably didn't know. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Thank you guys for sticking around. I hope you're enjoying today. Today we're talking about birds of prey, fascinating birds and the amazing power they present, and some interesting inspirations derived from them. So we've talked about a lot of birds of prey already. Eagles, falcons, hawks, owls. But one that we haven't talked about is definitely one that gets a pretty bad rep. Known for being nasty, known for being pretty much the worst kind of bird, and probably known mostly for being the evil, villainous bird character in any animated, children's movie ever made. We're talking about vultures. Now, vultures are actually pretty cool if you take the time to get to know more about them. Now, it doesn't mean that they are nice birds, but it does mean that they are interesting birds. I myself have had an experience with vultures in the past. Working at an animal institute, I got to work with some vultures that were just released back into their habitat, and 3 of them were absolutely fine with me, but one of them seemed to have a specific problem and decided to charge at me. I, of course, just decided to run, and I cleared a fence in one jump, something I'm still pretty impressed about to this day. But that still doesn't mean the fact that I don't appreciate vultures nonetheless. Vultures are interesting simply in the fact that they have multiple classifications of them, And unlike most animals that, well, specifically most birds of prey that actually hunt their food, vultures are scavengers, and they're probably one of the only birds of prey that are heavily rely on scavenging. Scavenging means that rather than hunting down for food, they usually pick up the remains of other foods, such as dead animals or leftover stuff laying around. But it still seems to do very well for them as well. Now, what is interesting about them, and this is definitely something I find interesting, is that there are two categories of vultures, Old World and New World vultures. Now, there is a bit of a difference between them, but a lot of times you'll see a lot of buzzards and hawk vultures around in the area, whereas New World vultures tend to be a lot more of the longer, more unusual raptor types. They'll usually have good sense of smell. Black vultures, turkey vultures, California condor. You'll see a lot more like those, a lot more bigger birds. So what's fascinating, again, is that they are scavengers, meaning that they rarely ever will, attack healthy animals, but they'll usually go for wounded or sick animals, or just whatever animal has recently passed away. So fun fact, if you ever just are lost in the wild and you're trying to find your way back home, it might be a good idea to follow the vultures if they're circling in the air, because they might have found an animal pretty recently, especially if you're more of a rural area, because typically animals tend to die near roads. So that's actually a pretty good fact. It's not a perfect fact, but it definitely is a useful thing to keep in mind if you're trying to find your way around. Now, here's something that's pretty fascinating, though, is that a lot of vultures, typically in hot areas, mainly a lot of Old World vultures, actually have very powerful corrosive stomach acid, which can help them burn and digest their food faster, but also help them to fight against toxins, bacteria, and a lot of things that would be lethal to most scavengers. So that's mainly in Old World vultures, whereas New World vultures actually have the ability to vomit. Now, this may sound really gross, but believe it or not, birds don't have that ability. Most birds can't vomit. So if they get sick or they eat something that would make them sick, they really wouldn't have a way to fight against it. But vultures, specifically New World vultures found here in the Americas, would have the ability to vomit. Old World vultures instead have more dangerous and I guess the word is corrosive stomach acids that would help them fight against bacteria. It's very amazing, honestly. Now, on top of that, there are a lot of other interesting things about vultures, a lot of other fascinating facts. But vultures are typically going to be people might see them as pests, but I find them as very fascinating creatures that are usually going to be very, intrusive, but in fact they're not. They just sort of they're nature's cleaning men. They clean up all the dead animals, and it sort of helps them pass around. But they're definitely very important creatures to the environment regardless. And they get around just the way they need to. Now, they're not like normal birds of prey, because we've already talked about birds of prey, how usually they'll have really small, sharp beaks. Vultures do indeed have sharp beaks, but they're a lot larger. Of course they are, because they need to be able to rip into their prey. Their talons are still big, but they aren't their main factor. And they don't have a lot of very special flying capabilities or anything like that. Rather, they have internal abilities that keep them alive and protected against disease, which is very different for vultures. Also, a fun fact, there is actually a breed of vulture that actually will eat bones along with food to actually help things sort of digest better as well. And there's one vulture that actually is like all black and might have like red in its mane as well, and it's like the death metal vulture, and it looks really awesome. But there's an interesting reason why I decided to talk about the bones as we parry back over into the fantasy and fiction side of things and to get a little nerdy. So one thing I thought was kind of interesting is when you look at Old World and New World vultures, typically the Old World vultures are more like buzzards. They're the ones that have like the bald heads and have big tufts on them, whereas New World vultures kind of look more like hawks. It's interesting. And there's really only one Pokemon that has a Vulture status, and that's a Pokemon by the name of Mandibuzz. And that's actually really important. I'm going to get to that name in a little while. But this Pokemon's very interesting, and its pre-form have like sort of skulls decored around it, big tufts, has the, buzzard-like head, big curved beak, which again definitely plays into the fact of it's a raptor. However, it does have sharp talons, but it's not as sharp as others. Now, it is a flying type, but it's also a dark type, because people usually assume it's a dark, evil creature, vultures, when in reality they're scavengers. They don't take down prey, they usually just take whatever's left over. Now, it's very fascinating as well. Hence the sort of skull motif it might have around it, or like the bones on it as well. Now, what's interesting about this creature is that it has more dark type moves, so instead of being more flying type, instead of soaring and stuff, it usually has the dark motif going on for it. Fascinating enough because, again, people see vultures as dark or, morbid, which in some cases it may be true, but in reality, it's just its natural living. Now, on top of all of that, something is interesting about this creature is that this design is actually heavily based off the old world vulture known as the white-rumped vulture. Now, looking at a white-rumped vulture, yes, it does have a lot of that inspiration. Specifically, what's really important is it has this sort of white sort of tuft around its neck that kind of looks like a big fluffy coat, and a dark coloring along with the bold vulture head, which is very, very reminiscent of good design. But what's also very fascinating about this creature is, again, the bone motif, as I've already previously explained, is that this creature has the ability, with the bones added onto it to sort of add a ruthless motif to it. Now, what is cool is that the name Mandibuzz comes from the meaning of mandible, which usually mandible has something to do with your head, and buzzard. So buzzards are another way to call vultures and sometimes other raptors as well. And what I really did enjoy about this design too, keep in mind it's an old world vulture, so it also has a slight caveman design too, being a lot more shall we say ruthless, having a lot more edge to it as well. As we've already explained, old world vultures have the ability of corrosive acid in their stomach to fight against bacteria and seeming a little less refined, which is actually a really smart design for such a, quote, ruthless creature. If it was a more new world vulture, it would probably look a lot sleeker and newer. So that's actually really smart and why I love this series so much. It's really creative and really smart with its designs. With that being said, we're going to go on another quick break, and when we come back, we're going to wrap this all up nicely and just talk about birds, bird nerds, and all the fun that we can have talking about the amazing birds of prey. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And thank you guys for sticking around today. I hope you're enjoying today. We're talking about birds of prey, the amazing abilities they have, and how cool flying type Pokemon are as well. That's right, we're getting nerdy today. So we've been talking about birds of prey. Birds of prey being larger birds that typically feed on smaller animals, vertebrae typically. and they all have some pretty common commonalities, being sharp talons, sharp beaks, incredible strength. And this is what is fascinating about these creatures, is that they're just simply a lot larger, that they have very unique abilities as opposed to some other type of animals. Smaller animals such as simple robins, blue jays, and such, typically will have longer beaks, will typically have incredibly unintimidating whatsoever, but they all have something, usually in regards for their sound or their colors, that make them stand out, but don't typically make them any type of a threat. In fact, it's very fascinating to me to get to watch smaller birds attack birds of prey. Typically, birds of prey don't attack other birds. They usually go for land-based animals or sea-based animals. On occasion, they'll go for other birds, but not as often as they will for some of these other creatures. What makes it fascinating, though, is that a lot of times, you'll actually see smaller birds actually take the initiative and fight back against them, usually about 2 or 3 against 1. Very frequently, I see falcons getting bombarded by small mockingjays because the reason why is simply because these smaller birds feel incredibly intimidated by such a larger bird, and rightly so. Perhaps that bird might want to take their roosting spot. Perhaps that bird might be attacking while they're young or anything. And it's always curious to know why. But it really does fascinate me how often these little birds will try to take a stand against such bigger, formidable foes, ones that can probably knock them out of the sky, incredibly powerful. And one thing I've also noticed is that although one of my favorite species of birds are corvids, aka crows, one thing I've noticed is that sometimes even crows will attack against these larger birds of prey, and while crows are impressive flyers, they aren't powerful flyers. So while it may take a crow a good 10, 20 flaps to get up to a certain altitude, that's about as high as it's going to get, that same bird of prey, like a falcon or a hawk, only takes about 2 or 3 flaps, and then it can still keep going higher. It does show that there's a huge difference in power between both of these species, although they're very similar in design. Some of them are made for soaring, some of them are made for power, whereas other ones are only made for small communication, local areas, and they have to adapt to survive. One adapts through power and cunning, and the other adapts through skill, knowledge, and wit. It's very interesting when you take the time to look at it. And that's why I find birds just so fascinating, is that they vary in size, but they have amazing abilities to sort of, they all have different abilities and strengths that make them so fascinating. Right now, we have a great opportunity to get to really take the time to study them. So, if at this time right now, while we're all kind of stuck, as of this recording, if you're all kind of stuck inside, or even if you're not stuck inside, maybe you just have the day off or you want a new hobby, maybe go start yourself up a little bird watching expedition. All you need to do is go outside and just sit and watch. You'll probably hear a falcon or a hawk flying over your house any day now. And if you decide maybe you want to throw some seeds out in the back or maybe some fruit, a good idea is to get some shelled peanuts or some unshelled peanuts as well. Throw them in your backyard and just watch. Maybe get yourself a bird feeder as well. You probably won't be getting yourself a lot of birds of prey with the bird feeder, but you might get some interesting birds around, and you might start seeing some more smaller animals, and after a while you might see some birds of prey popping around. Definitely consider, if you can, go near the trees, go into a forested or a well-treed area. You might start seeing some interesting birds flying around, especially right now while there's less commotion outside. I find a lot of birds seem to be hanging around more often. And they are so fascinating as creatures. They always have something unique that just kind of surprises me every single time. There's so many other varieties of birds of prey that I couldn't even get into in this whole hour I have to talk to you all. But they are, regardless, fascinating creatures who just go such far distances and have range of abilities, their eyesight, their power, their talents, and it's just that time to get to learn and study them is what makes them fascinating. Now, I mean, I guess something that's also important to mention is that most of these birds aren't going to make the best pets. You usually need to be a licensed trainer to even be able to handle one of these or consider even having one. There are falconeers and hawk trainers who do train these birds to help them hunt or do specific tricks. I don't always think this is bad, but this isn't always a well-received practice in some cases as well. One thing definitely to consider is if you plan to do much with this, make sure the bird is always treated with as much care as you can. And always, of course, remember that it still is an animal if you ever decide to go into this field. But there aren't a lot of places that will really have that ability open for you as well. But getting the ability to study them, I'm sure you have a local institute somewhere around you you can always go and check out. And if not, if you don't have one nearby you or it's not open because of obvious reasons, then just sit in your backyard. You'll probably see some flying around. I've seen at least 3 today, and it's been fascinating just to get to watch them fly around. I got to see some birds mad at other birds. I got to see one just sitting there watching. They are really amazing creatures. And of course, I always have to go back to media and entertainment. Keep in mind, if you ever hear a large bird screeching on TV, it's probably going to be a hawk because a lot of other birds don't have that much of a power behind their call. And of course, I always say if you can find an interesting video game that has inspiration or maybe has some longevity, you might find some really interesting inspiration for it. Birds have some of the best, just range of information, have some of the best range of inspiration that I just love to get to see and learn a little bit more about. I mean, there are some birds I haven't talked about, ostriches and emus, peacocks. There's so many fascinating aviary creatures out there. And that's just some of the fun. I get to sit here and talk about it, and if you guys enjoy what I'm saying, please leave some comments behind and tell me what kind of birds you like. What's your favorite type of bird of prey? What kind of ability would you want to have if you were a bird? I'm kind of feeling the stealth flight of owls, but I also really like the range that falcons have, the ability to fly in one place and sort of the range and mobility in their flight. But also, falcons being really smart, especially that fearlessness and the dive bombing sounds really cool. They're all just pretty cool to me. But I might go for stealth flight just because it's more fun. But that's just me. That's how I like to think about things. I think they're cool. And there's so many interesting things about the animals out there. And if you just take a moment, you can take some time to learn about them too. But with that being said, thank you guys for listening to the GSMC Pets Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you like what you heard today, please consider liking and subscribing to this podcast. Also leaving a comment below on the podcast if you heard anything you liked today, or maybe you want to hear a specific topic to talk about. We can do that. Also, if you really want to get in contact with us, follow us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I'd like to thank you guys for coming today, and as always, have a great day and learn something about an animal.
You've been listening to the GSMC Pets Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's podcast.